that I'm live. Oh look, there we go. Yes, I am most definitely live. Isn't that wonderful? So this evening I'm going to be speaking about speculative fiction. What we were hoping to do was sort of talk a bit about writing speculative fiction, but I think something that's a lot more pressing for me at the moment is kind of the concept of what speculative fiction is going to do from this point. And I find that to be a really fascinating kind of question. And I think it's something that's really important to talk about. I'm always happy to talk to people about writing speculative fiction, but I'm also really interested in thinking about what speculative fiction can do, what it means, where it's going, and yeah, so I thought that I kind of focus a bit more on that than specifically on writing this speculative fiction. If anyone has questions for me in regards to actually writing, please let me know. I will be able to take your questions, and I'm happy to take questions sort of mid talk, just as long as you wait till I finish my section, and then I can look at your questions and go through them. Then I'm not known for my keeping good attention on two things at once. So for to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge, and Moreland City Libraries also likes to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional custodians of the lands and the waterways and the area now known as Moreland. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as to all First Nations communities who contribute to the life of this area. I should introduce myself to begin with. My name's Marlee Jane Ward. I'm currently sitting in my living room. Isn't that nice? So I'm the author of the Orphancorp series, which is excitingly currently in early development for the screen. My fiction has won Victorian Premier's Literary Award for YA fiction, the Viva Novella Prize, and been nominated for Aurealis Awards and lots of exciting things. You can find my fiction all linked on my website, which is just my name, which is very convenient. So let me just take a second to look awkward while I bring up the right windows on my screen. Wonderfully professional as I am. Okay. So now I'm just getting to my actual things that I want to talk about. So I guess the first question is, like, what is it even? What is speculative fiction? I think it's a lot like that saying that you know it when you see it, which is in reference to something completely different. It's a single word to describe a lot of things and a lot of storytelling modes that share a similar vibe. And I guess there's stories that are not quite of this world. So similarly vibing genres are like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, dystopian, apocalyptic, weird fiction, bizarro fiction, slipstream. I could go on because there are so many different subgenres that make up the genre. But I like to think of it as a genre for weirdos and for genre smashers and genre threaders. Bi-genre, poly-genre. So if you can't imagine what on earth to call whatever you've just written, then it's probably speculative fiction in some way, shape or form. So give me a second. So because I've focused a lot of my longer work and a lot of my shorter work too, on dystopian genre. And my shorter stuff kind of mashes sci-fi and apocalyptic fiction and maybe some horror. That's what I feel the most confident speaking about. And it's what I spend the majority of my time thinking about. So that is to say, I don't know everything about all genres of speculative fiction. I'm not particularly into fantasy, and I don't read much magical realism. So yeah, I'm not the queen of genre, and I'm not containing all of the wisdom of the genre. In fact, I do not even claim to have read many of the classics of the speculative genre. I find it really difficult to concentrate on stuff that I'm not really into, and most of the stuff considered to be part of the golden age of sci-fi just isn't to my taste, and it's such a boys' club, a problematic boys' club. So, well, which boys' clubs aren't problematic, but so I don't always enjoy the process of reading it. I do find I really like a lot of the ideas, and I've been sure to read a lot about like the history of the genre and about the golden age texts that a lot of people draw from, so that I understand their place in the canon and how we got here, and like what the history of the genre means and contains and reveals. I just don't find it easy to read books that I don't like very much. So forgive me, but I also, sorry, not sorry. So one thing that's really interesting in regards to science fiction and speculative fiction is that it's about sci-fi from the past, is that it's a reflection of that past. So when they're speculating into the future, it's a speculation of what the current concerns and the modern day concerns are most pressing and most gripping the world at the time. So yeah, it's always it's always like a reflection of the period that it comes from. It's why the technology, the language, and the casual racism and sexism is all so out of place now. But it speaks to the fears of the time, and it's always heavily influenced by the concerns of the world that is rapidly changing. So if we move kind of to the contemporary arena of speculative fiction, it's actually a more exciting place to be, in my opinion, because it's crammed full of really exciting people who are very smart and very creative. But the most important aspect of that is that it's finally broadening in its diversity, and we are starting to see stories from communities that we have not always seen stories from. And I think that kind of does work to my bias against the golden age, in that they're all coming from a perspective that is very familiar, and that is the dominant perspective. And sometimes you just want something that's not that, and we had hundreds of years of that, so like there's no exciting stuff happening. So we're starting to see work from marginalized communities and non-Western writers and non-Western perspectives that have been under represented, or just plain not represented at all. And I believe that what we're going through at the moment is like a really beautiful new golden age of science fiction, where it's diverse and kind, and people are trying to respect each other and make a good world. And I guess that kind of moves on to a few points that I wanted to make later. At this very point in time, we're in kind of a flux, and it's quite interesting. I never thought a global emergency would be like this. I thought it would be some boom, like, kind of thing, with a whimper and not a bang. But I'm not sure what I expected it would be, but it wasn't this. So I thought that there'd be a clear enemy in power, and I thought I'd be part of a grubby and rakishly good-looking mob of sexy resistance fighters. I'd be like walking away from an explosion in like a grubby tank top and the smear of dirt on my face. And I was definitely expecting more love triangles. And I thought we'd just better mold leather. I didn't predict the rise of activewear or the face mask. But it just goes to show that it's really difficult to be speculating on the future when the parameters of the present get rewritten on a daily basis or an hourly basis, it feels. And it's interesting as a person, especially somebody who is neurodiverse and who does have some issues with coping with all of this, and being a speculative fiction author, because how can you engage with the present and speculate on the future when you have difficulty engaging with just what's going on around you? It can be very stressful. And I wonder if that's going to have an effect on or influence the path of speculative fiction. I don't know. A lot of the writers that I know are tender, sweet things, and I'm sure the last year has been really hard on them. Where does that collective trauma and where does this digital luxury dystopia, where's that we're living in, where is that going to take speculative fiction in the future? So it's something interesting to think about. I do know I've had a couple of works that I've scrapped because it's like, that's not relevant. That's not relevant any longer. So, give me a second. So, if you think about our own new personal world order, it's all very comfortable and solitary and techy. It's not fully automated luxury communism or dystopia, but it's like a working class, work from home, pajamas and cup of tea disaster. It's a very Netflix dystopia or apocalypse. I'm alone and I'm plugged in, I'm hardwired and virtual, but at the same time I'm firm and real and mundane. The one nice thing about the rise of all of this is that right now I'm sitting in my comfy chair in my living room. I've had food poisoning, so it's one nice thing that even though I'm ill, I can still have a chat with you. I can still do my event, which is super important for me, even if I maybe wouldn't be able to be there in person if I was doing that today. So thanks, technology. So back to the present dystopia that we're living in. It's slow, it's painfully slow, and it's a flux that doesn't end. And I think the stress of having to like recalibrate the expectations of the future on a monthly, weekly, or daily basis is really affecting us. I think our descent into the new normal of this is going to take years, and that's probably I promise I'm actually going to make a point about speculative fiction and not just like our own lives, and especially what we, the people of Melbourne, have gone through in the past year. But that it is interesting that not a lot of speculative fiction captures this flux that we're living in. they're always set in a really established world order, because because flux and uncertainty don't make for good plot points. They don't create a lot of action. I think our recent liminal plotless existence is the stuff of literary fiction. Though, speaking of literary fiction, or contemporary fiction at all, I read somewhere like a year ago that if contemporary and literary fiction isn't engaging with climate change at this point, it can't really be called or considered contemporary. So we're dragging all you lit folks into our genre. Come on, the water's getting hotter every year. So back to what I was talking about. The few texts that I can think of that even touch on this state of flux that we're in, and it's not even a book, it's a film. It's the film Children of Men, and anyone who knows me knows that I will do my very best to talk about that film at any point. But yeah, I think that it's one of the only sort of speculative texts that captures this state of kind of, it's like a grinding state of flux, and so I think it's considered almost dystopian and pre-apocalyptic, even though that's not really a genre. I do think that Severance by Ling Ma is also another book that I've read recently that does capture the slow kind of grind of actual real life change. But I'm going to talk more about Children of Men because I love it and I know it a lot better. So it doesn't necessarily linger on a slow descent, because the narrative kind of quickly hits the nadir of societal dysfunction, and it begins like a relentless drive upwards towards its ending. Not necessarily the ending, because that movie ends ambiguously. We don't know what's going to happen. But we do get glimpses of the sort of long, slow goodbye. And it does have a lot of interesting parallels to what we've been experiencing now. So the cozy, well-lit home where the character Jasper cares for his wife and listens to Aphex Twin and Radiohead, and it all places things in an identifiable time and range. It speaks of a familiar middle-class life that's really relatable to most of us. It's a more isolated life than what a lot of us are used to, both geographically or emotionally, but I think we're all getting a bit more used to that right now. But it's one with modern comforts that's relatively free from government intrusion, whilst still having things, the parameters being strictly in force. But the details of that long, slow grind are there, and they're subtle. It's the way the main character, Theo, is always nipping from his flask, his bleak and hollowed demeanor, his craggy face, both are evidence of long-term low-level stress that comes from this endless downward liminality. I can't say it, but I do need to say the words liminal at least once every 3 talks I give, because I have an arts degree. It's the rules. We only get a really small part of that slow grinding downward spiral because it's not interesting. It's not relatable, but it does hit bottom in that text. And whether you think it's when we come to an end for the character Jasper, or it's when Theo finds the character Key, who could be the savior of the world, when the character Julian is killed, or could it even be the point in the first 1 minute and 40 seconds where a bomb explodes on a city street? I think it's open for interpretation, but in that moment we actually capture something that is, when it came out, was not relatable, but has suddenly become quite relatable. And it's all just turned up just that little bit. So this isolation, this luxury isolation, the long, slow, grinding levels of stress, in particular the xenophobia that a few years ago to my white girl working class existence seemed so far away has suddenly started to feel very close. I don't know, I could turn this into an hour-long chat on Children of Men and why it's the best movie ever, but I won't. It's just an example that is the only thing I could think of that was that actually explored the realistic banality of disaster or dystopia. And I would really love to know if any people who are watching have seen any or read any that do cover it in the same sort of way, because obviously I can't read everything, but like I am interested to see other depictions of this kind of interesting global strife. So one moment, allow me to go through my notes here. So I guess all of this is to say that, in my opinion, the speculative fiction that I like to read is something that is slightly relatable, and something that explores where we're going from where we are. And at this point in time, I think that speculative fiction is really important. I think that it has a role, and I think that all of this comes down to what you believe is the purpose of speculative fiction. Is it the role of it to do something? Should it teach us and plant the seeds of change and be political, or is it to entertain? And I'm a kind of annoying, ambivalent person who thinks it should be both. So while I absolutely adore a good fun read, like a nice fun speculative romp through space, or a rollicking good time, sometimes I want that lightness and fun and to be entertained, but sometimes I want to read books that try to do something or teach something or try to change the world. Those are the books that I remember, and those are the books that have shaped me as a person and changed my mind. I think the real power of speculative fiction is to allow people to themselves speculate on different perspectives, different futures, how the world could be. I think a lot of fiction kind of focuses on like the worst of it, but at the same time, I think there's the potential to focus on the best of it. So yeah, I guess if you believe in the power of speculative fiction to disrupt the status quo, and you might like the rest of the things that I'm going to talk about. The one thing that I really think is important for speculative fiction that is coming out at the moment in this current time, excuse me, is that I'd really like to be creating fiction that models resistance and resilience, because I think that these are two very specific and pertinent attributes to have in the current day. So, for instance, when I was writing my first book, I have books. I forgot to say it. When I was writing my first book, Welcome to Orphancorp, I decided that I wanted to model some things that I really wanted to see in fiction. And when I kind of realized that it might appeal to a young adult audience, I also decided to model some things that I wish that I had seen when I was a teenager or a younger person. And so I did put in a lot about consent and respect and I just think that it's a really important thing to not only entertain, because like I'm not saying we all need to write dry directive fiction that teaches people how to do this and that, but I think the best fiction and the best speculative fiction really beautifully merges lightness and entertainment with important messages, and modeling is one way that you do that. I just learnt so much from the books that I read when I was younger. I saw worlds that I wouldn't have otherwise known about, and I think that personally it made me a much more open person than I could have been. So as a writer, I remember that, and I always try to write with it in mind. And I remember reading a quote by Veronica Roth, where she said, I wanted, in other words, to articulate what I might want to see in the world, rather than to point out what I didn't want. And I thought that was just spot on. I thought that was exactly what the kind of books that I wanted to create. While we might all exist in really difficult circumstances, and my books are by no means full of easy circumstances, and they're by no means full of perfect people, perfect characters, showing at least what the qualities that you want to see in the world it's the way that people learn about those qualities. It's the way that people learn to recognize that. So I've got another quote from someone called Carolyn Zielinski, which says speculative fiction exists to show us a way out, which I thought was really interesting, and definitely thought was something that I found really important. Give me one moment. Keep going through. So one thing that I've noticed a lot about the speculative genre is there are a lot of things. There's so much that there's no way I could cover it in all of this. One thing that was sticking out to me a lot in my notes, especially because I write dystopian fiction and obviously read a lot, is the chosen one narrative, which is something that really makes me tired. I'm just tired of seeing it. But the chosen one trope leaves so much room for both grandiosity and complacency. It really speaks to the individualism of this time, of our present time, in that there's that one person who will come along, and it could be you, and you could be the person who solves everything or brings the government down. And I thought that maybe a much nicer and probably more productive way of, or mode of telling stories that have that outcome is to talk about communities instead of singularity. I think that that's something, once again, that we really need modeled for us at this time, or focused on, is that community building, and that no one is an island, even though in our own houses at the moment we feel a lot like islands. So I personally think that speculative fiction can change the world, and I think that the genre, especially if you're thinking of dark genres like dystopian fiction, like apocalyptic fiction, and all of those kinds of stories, I guess these genres sort of serve now to show us that the only way out is through, and here's how you make a battering ram. And that's how fiction writers can do their little teeny part to change the world, because I guess part of changing the world is changing the mind of one person. And if you change the mind of enough people, then, I don't know, in my opinion, that's being a successful speculative fiction writer. I do notice that there's some writing down the side. I have not been reading it. So there's one question about writing Welcome to Orphancorp, which is my first book. So what inspired Welcome to Orphancorp? And what sort of research did you do for the trilogy? So this is my first book, Welcome to Orphancorp. It is a very small book. It was inspired basically by, in a similar way to what I was talking about before, it was inspired by taking aspects of today's world and imagining their most hideous outcome. And so I think I can't remember where I read it, but somebody once said that writing your first book takes a lot longer than writing your second book, because your first book you spent your whole life preparing to write it, whereas your second book happens a lot quicker. I feel like all of the things that I have learned in my life have contributed to making that book. All of the things that I was interested in and wanted to be, I jammed them all in there. So I do remember specifically watching a documentary when I was very young about orphanages in Romania that I think planted the very first seeds of that idea, or at least left me with a interest in or horror of what I had seen. Regardless, it never left me. So when I went to write the book, I ended up spending a lot of time looking into that, and Romania's orphanage system was horrifying, and there's a long story behind it. It's interesting and terrible if you ever want to read it. But I ended up doing a lot of research into that. I did research into Indigenous Australian astronomy, which is, for how much I read about it, it's a really small part of the book, but that's what happens. So that was a big part of it. I also, I get my research for even small parts of fiction from reading long-form articles. I read a long-form article about, it's called Myths Over Miami. I think it was written in 1997, and it's about homeless children who created their own, I guess, mythology, which was really interesting, and once again only influenced a very small part of the book, but played a really important role in my imaginings of that world. Yeah, I've got another question. So this question is, how do you approach writing speculative fiction when you include cultures that aren't your own, that you don't have close ties to, i.e. research, working with sensitivity readers, etc.? This question is very close to my heart. So my first book, the main character is a biracial Indigenous character. I wrote that book in 2014, and I didn't really I wasn't as aware of the best ways to go about things. So if I'd had the chance to write it now, I would have written it completely differently, because, you know, I'd never heard the phrase, nothing about us without us. But as soon as I did, I definitely, obviously understood, but also definitely wished that I had known that earlier or realized it. And it's been something that's caused me like a lot of regret, because I believe that you can do as much research as you want. Like, you can do so much research, and I did a whole lot of research, but you can't ever know. You can't ever know. And sensitivity readers were probably most certainly a thing, but as I didn't know about them. I actually do work now as a sensitivity reader, and they're great to have. So yeah, I think that in writing my first book, there was so much that I wish I had known, and so I'm here to tell you now. Learn from my mistakes. So yeah, there are heaps of sensitivity readers who will read your fiction for best practice representation of all marginalized people and characters. It's really important to have this done, because there is a history that for all marginalized cultures that you have no idea of, that you just don't know. Excuse me. So my main aim in life is to not hurt anybody. That's like my entire shtick. It's the whole aim of my existence, is to like be rad to everybody. And one way that you be rad to everybody is to take people's lives and feelings and history into consideration before you do anything. So yeah, sensitivity readers can be a bit hard to find for like specific things, but like, if you reach out to one, they will know heaps of people who come from an own voices perspective and who can give you a sensitivity read. Also, you've got to pay them, and pay them well, because it's work. It's a lot of work. I've done a couple of sensitivity reads now, and it's a lot of work. So yeah, research can only take you so far. If you are writing about another culture that's not your own, really think about doing that in the first place. And then if you do it in consultation with people of that culture, because there are so many tiny things that you would never think of, and that could really hurt somebody if you get it wrong. Yeah, and that's my main concern in life. I want everyone to be okay. So I just noticed another question. Or did I? No, I totally didn't. Alright. Yeah, if you reach out to any sensitivity authors, any sensitivity writers, they'll be able to point you in the direction of 10 million different sensitivity writers who write for all different kinds of best practices. And it's really important work, and it's a really important thing to do. It's a really interesting balance between wanting to show the diversity that I see in my world and not wanting to tell a story that's not my own. And so navigating that is difficult, and I probably don't have the right answers, but we'll all keep working on it and keep doing our best to make sure that we're doing things all right and in a way that doesn't make anyone sad and doesn't hurt people, especially people who have dealt with a lifetime of hurt. Yeah, so if anybody has any more questions, that would be great. If not, I've got heaps of stuff that I could talk about. I'll give it a moment. Oh, here we go. Thank you, Moreland City Libraries, for putting these links at the side. It's very helpful. So I've been thinking about speculative fiction, specifically, especially because we're living through such interesting times. And there are a lot of people who are sort of busting out the Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, 1984, kind of dystopias, and comparing what we're going through to that, and calling a lot of different books and stuff prescient, which a lot of them are. If you're looking for something that really does actually not predict but explore a lot of the things that we're going through at the moment, I would highly recommend The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. I'm just rereading this at the moment. I read it a while ago, and it is phenomenal. It's spot on. There are so many different things that are relatable to our current world, and so many interesting questions that it brings up about what we could be doing from this point, what could happen. Yeah, highly recommend Parable of the Sower. I'm really interested to see from this point what speculative fiction does in the future, where it starts to go, what themes it starts to explore. Because I do think that speculative fiction kind of, it starts trends. It's weird, but it starts trends. Speculative fiction writers are a bunch of extremely, at least the ones that I know, are a bunch of extremely open, progressive, interesting, fascinating, diverse people, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future, and what we do with what's happening now, and how we tell that story, and how we speculate on the future, and what's going to come out of it. One thing that I think that gives me hope in these awful times is just how weird I think this experience is going to make us all. It's what keeps me going. I was just reminded, there's another book that's extremely prescient in regards to our current mid-pandemic state. It's called, I haven't finished it yet, it's called Song for a New Day by Sarah Pinksar. And interestingly, it's about a pandemic, or life after a pandemic, which is fascinating. There are some real interesting points in this that are incredibly pertinent to what we're going through now. So if anybody's looking for something that that was written before the current state of affairs, but that says a lot about what it is now, I would very much recommend that. Song for a New Day by Sarah Pinksar. I just saw another question. Okay, how do you view those challenges when writing future tense stories? It's different about writing people's past present stories compared with how you see those cultures evolving into the future. Once again, culturally, while you can sort of speculate on what the future is for specific peoples, the future always contains, the future is made up of the past. So while I might be talking about historical struggles of marginalized people, those struggles do inform what will come. They will inform the future, and so they cannot really be ignored. So you can't really look at a culture, especially a culture that's not your own, and say, here's what I predict for the future, without taking into great consideration what the present looks like, what the past looks like, because all of that feeds the future. Yeah, it's writing different cultures is a scary minefield, especially when you are a person like me, doesn't want to be horrible to anybody. Yeah, so once again, the same thing is that it's always take it under advisement, and never try to tell a story that's not your own. Yeah, it's tricky. It's not an easy thing, but unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but as a dominant culture, it's sort of on us to do that kind of work, out of respect, I guess, for the people who have to live it every day. Yeah, so we should probably learn from them, but not expect them to teach us and pay them for it, is sort of my consensus. Yeah, I think oh, look at that. I'm at 46 minutes. I've done really well, considering. If there are any other questions, please let me know. In the meantime, I'm going to talk about some writers who I believe are doing some really interesting things with speculative fiction. Oh, okay, sorry. What advice do I have regarding world building? I can definitely talk about this. Give me one moment and let me bring up some notes. So world building is pretty much my favorite part of writing speculative fiction. It's I'm really lucky in that the worlds that I create sort of kind of appear in my head, and I know that doesn't happen for everybody, but I think I'm just lucky in that way. Sorry, trying to find some notes on world building, because as always happens to me, as soon as somebody asks me a question about something, everything I've ever known about it completely flies out of my head. One thing that I think is really important about world building is, for me, I enjoy subtle world building. I trust my audience. I trust their imaginations. Like I know that my audience can fill in the little blanks that I can't show. And so I've always been a really kind of person who likes really light world building, really subtle touches, and sorry, I have everything open, but absolutely nothing about world building. Yeah, so subtle touches is great. People world build in all sorts of different ways, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about world building exactly, because I'm not the kind of person who does character sheets or descriptions of settings and things like that. Like, I just happens, which is not very helpful. But I do know of lots of tips that do help. I remember reading once that if you're creating a really rich, specifically a really rich fantasy world, you want to know how the economic system works. You want to know where, how does the sewage system work? Like, how does the financial system work in your world? You don't need to show that to a reader, but you need to know it. And I think that's like a perfect example of how to balance world building, is that you need to know everything, and then you need to give the reader what they need to know, because they might not need to know how the financial system works. They might not need to know they might not need to know how the septic system works, but in knowing that, that leads to so many different aspects of the world that you then know about. Sometimes I feel, in regards to my world building, as if I'm kind of like the reader, in that I often see stuff as the reader sees it. So I'm discovering it along with you. And I find that I do actually know a lot about these worlds. I just don't necessarily have access to it right away, which, you know, it's really helpful then for me to say, use a light touch with world building, but when that's actually the only method that's accessible to me. All right, so I think our time is almost up. I am really grateful for everybody for listening to my my favored ramblings. And yeah, I'm really glad that I didn't hurl during this. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Please ask me any questions about writing speculative fiction, because I love to talk about it. Just ask me on Twitter. You can find me there. And thank you for creating some sense from everything that I just said. It's been great. Thanks.